Some specific things that Dr. Aguilar talks about, he points out some important things to me. I left the committee at the end of December 1978. The report was written in the months that followed that. He pointed out a reference that said that our report indicated that the Bethesda persons present at the autopsy contradicted the eyewitness accounts of the doctors at Parkland. He also sent me copies of excerpts from some of the witness interviews that Mark Flanagan and I and others conducted of the people who we were able to locate were present at or around the autopsy. And a quick reading of that testimony indicates that our report stating that everyone disagreed with the accounts from Parkland was not a correct statement. I certainly don't think that I had anything to do with the writing of that statement. I do know that I recommended that all those reports be made part of the public record and had every expectation they would be made part of the public record, and was surprised to find out years later that the interview reports with the people at Bethesda were part of the sealed record, which I guess were sealed for 50 years. So when Dr. Aguilar says to me that, well, doesn't it look pretty bad that the records which contradict that conclusory statement about the differences between the Bethesda and Parkland doctors look pretty bad and look like the committee was doing the same thing that people criticized the Warren Commission of, and I say yes. I mean, it does look bad. It was ridiculous. I can't understand why in the world they didn't print those interview statements in the public record, and I'm glad they came out. In fact, before the legislation passed to release those documents, I wrote a lengthy letter to Congressman Stokes and spoke to him on the telephone, urging him to support that legislation to open up all those documents, and I was pleased that he did, and the documents are now available. I think that's all I want to say for now, because I'll have the chance to respond to some of the more particular points later on and give others a chance to make their opening presentations. Thank you.
And by the way, the skull fragment will be raffled off at the dinner. Thank all of our panelists, certainly, for the time and effort. This is not something you do in a couple of nights and say, I'm going to come down here to Washington and present this. This takes an immense amount of time. I would also like to thank, on behalf of all of us, the three gentlemen from the House Select Committee who perhaps came before a slightly hostile audience. I deeply respect them for their courage to come here and say, this is what we did, this is the process. Please, thank you.
First,
Dr. Bowden again, why do you believe there is an entry wound at the level of the cowlick?
Number one, I just regret very much that Cyril's losing his voice, and he has to write. When we examined the photographs, some of which you've seen, I didn't show a photograph with the autopsy photograph of the back of the head with the arm holding it up. That particular photograph was very helpful in determining that the area in the cowlick was the abrasion collar of an entrance gunshot wound, and that the area in the external occipital protuberance that's been discussed, where there was some material present that Humes thought, that Humes had listed as being the entrance wound, wasn't an entrance wound. It had adherent brain. We compared this then to the x-rays, the lateral x-ray that was taken at the time of the autopsy, which we authenticated, incidentally. You had a session on authentication. Through the good offices of Andy Purdy, we went around to about 8 different physicians who had treated President Kennedy previously when he was a senator and a congressman, and we got something like 8 different files of skull x-rays. He was getting x-rays because of his Addison's disease and looking at the pituitary gland. And we were able to match up of the, I think the 13, were there 13 x-rays taken? Or 12 of them we were able to match with prior x-rays done years before, and we're able to identify that these were the true x-rays of President Kennedy. And when we looked at the lateral x-rays, there's the fracture of the skull right underneath the area of the photograph showing the entrance, what we interpreted entrance perforation, and those were two of the important reasons that we thought and concluded that that was the entrance. There was no fracture corresponding to the external occipital protuberance where Dr. Humes had listed as the entrance wound, and then that he recanted again after talking to Dr. Petty in his testimony under oath, which he again may have been changed.
Okay, another question for you, Dr. Bodden. Boswell clearly states that some occipital bone is missing. Do you accept this?
He's wrong. Boswell, there isn't any. Remember, people in Parkland talked about some of the cerebellum being found in the Parkland Hospital. It's unfortunate that physicians who may be super at doing brain surgery or other kinds of surgery don't have training in gunshot wounds, and what was called cerebellum was not cerebellum. The cerebellum was entirely intact.
Can I make a quick comment on your comment,
Also,
Michael?
one other thing. We did see the photographs of the brain. The brain, having been removed, was photographed and then lost. We have ideas with that. But the photographs...
I think we'd like to hear your ideas. I think we'd like to hear your ideas on where it is.
The photographs of yeah, it's in the casket with President Kennedy. It was put there, in my opinion, from certain information after when the final resting place, the final burial was made when he was transferred. But the brain photographs show the trajectory through the top part of the cerebrum, which matches up with the bullet wound being in the cowlick area and shows the cerebellum to be perfectly intact, which would have been injured if Humes was correct. Okay.
I'm going to make just a quick comment on that. I asked Dr. Boswell about that and about Humes' recantation, and he said that they all sat down together before they wrote the JAMA articles or went through the interviews, and they both agreed, and Humes agreed that that the wounds were low in the skull, and Boswell told me, he says, listen, that testimony that he gave down there was suspect. He said, what's in the autopsy report is right, and you should see the documents that are being released now. Boswell and Fink were leaned on in letters and calls. All right, now listen, Humes is coming forward to change his mind. Are you guys willing to do it? Neither Boswell nor Fink would change his mind. Both of them were leaned on in private letters to come forward and recant, and they didn't. And now in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Humes is back on the record saying the wound was low.
Yeah, remember, Boswell and Humes had never done a gunshot wound autopsy before, had no training in it, and Pierre Fink had never done an autopsy in a gunshot wound either, although he had reviewed hundreds and hundreds of autopsies that were sent to him for review. But he didn't do the actual autopsies.
Yeah, it's hard for me to believe that they still don't know where the occipital bone is. I mean, I think that's something you would fail a first-year medical student for not knowing.
I'd like to get to as many of these questions as possible, but I think it's interesting to rhetorically ask, why did they have 3 people in a room that had never done a gunshot autopsy when it's the President of the United States? If it was you, you'd want that.
I'd just like to say there are a number of these points I'd like the chance to respond to before we break up this meeting.
Okay, third question for Dr. Bodden, and then we have one for Mr. Purdy. Dr. Bodden, in your experience as medical examiner in many autopsies or legal cases, can you cite examples when a military jacketed bullet shattered and left as many as 30 to 40 slivers or fragments in a skull?
One of the problems we had was that in civilian life we don't have military ammunition. So the odd situation of President Kennedy with the Mannlicher Carcano and then Dr. Martin Luther King with the 30-06 military ammunition is very unusual in civilian life. So even though in New York City we may have 2,000 homicides a year, there's something like none of them are military rifles, or very few are. I, in fact, called up Tom Marshall at that time, who was the medical examiner in Northern Ireland, to discuss with him the nature of the wounds he was finding in Northern Ireland, which were all rifle wounds. The problem is, be it Vietnam, be it World War II, or be it Northern Ireland, during wartime, autopsies aren't done to find out trajectories. And in civilian life, when you do autopsy, we don't see military ammunition. So that was one of the factors we had to deal with. But remember one thing, in civilian life, bullets are made so they don't go through the person, because you don't want to kill innocent people. In military ammunition, it's made by Geneva Convention and all. The bullets have to go through, should go through the body to cause less damage, and you don't care if it kills his friend either. You don't like his friend either. So that military ammunition are jacketed, very thick jacketed, high velocity to go through individuals, whereas civilian ammunition isn't. So there is a difference there.
Question, I take that as a no, that you didn't have much experience with it.
No, and I think
Okay.
Cyril said it accurately. He did challenge us to find a similar case in civilian life. The problem is even shooting dead grandmothers is not the same as shooting living grandmothers. Living bone has blood supply and is supple and is different than dead bone. So there's a lot of differences, and we can't right now shoot living people, except in certain states.
Sure, we'd like to. Question for Mr. Purdy. When you examined the windshield at the National Archives, was there any detectable blood stains on the windshield on the driver's side?
I didn't see any.
Question again for, I think you answered this. Dr. Bodden, you were critical in your 1989 book of the JFK autopsy doctors, yet when JAMA came forward, 1992, you remained silent. The question is, didn't you feel you had some kind of duty to the people to speak, at least with respect to the expertise of the doctors doing it?
Maybe Cyril can answer. Cyril responded. I am critical not only of the autopsies of President Kennedy, but also the fact that, as I said, most autopsies of murder victims in the United States are performed by physicians who are not qualified to do those autopsies. That's the state of life in the United States. I did contact the JAMA after that, but I did not write something suitable for their publication.
Okay.
Let me just add a fast PS for this audience. You should know this. And Gary Aguilar, who spent so much time in addressing this with JAMA, just to show you the duplicity of Lundberg and what his true objectives were. His objectives were not to corroborate the Warren Commission report. His objectives were to rehabilitate the reputations of his two old military buddies, Humes and Boswell. When we had the meeting in Chicago 3 years ago, and Lundberg was given the opportunity and the right to select 3 or 4 scientific witnesses of his own to go up against us, he did not contact Michael or any of the other forensic pathologists from the panel. And when he wrote his articles and sent Dennis Brio around to interview people, they did not contact Michael. They stayed away, even from the pathologist who had corroborated the conclusions of the Warren Commission report, because Michael, as you have heard him today, has never been reluctant, nor have the others, in expressing their disdain. In fact, they spoke even more vehemently, perhaps, than I had, at least up until that time. I had tried to be a little bit of a gentleman, because I was attacking the conclusions. You see, they had to do more because they felt guilty about going along with the conclusions, so they had to attack the pathologist more strongly than I did. But I just want you to know that was the story behind Lundberg and JAMA. Keep that in mind. Not a Warren Commission defense, but a Humes Boswell defense.
This is a question generally for any of the panel members. Was there any evidence developed at the HSCA that there was autopsy work going, in other words, continued or restarted after FBI agents Siebert and O'Neill left the room?
Not that we're aware of.
Okay.
No, and I don't think, having seen what has been released, there is no evidence of that occurring. Yes, sir, Dr. Baden, I have obtained both the transcript and the tape recording of Dr. Ebersol's interview with the medical panel. And so I don't know if you felt me jump when you said that they didn't know about the throat wound at the time of autopsy, because Dr. Ebersol told you It's on tape.
What did he tell us?
He told you that they knew that there was a wound to the throat, that they had discussed it with Dallas in the course of the autopsy.
Yeah, you should understand here. We have Kellerman, Greer, and Dr. Berkeley, who had been in Parkland, who had been informed and given a summary about the evidence, who then traveled with the body to Bethesda. Everyone, during that period of time of the body being traveling to Bethesda, is pinned to their radio where they're talking about the president's wounds, including presumably the autopsy pathologist, but certainly most of the other people in the autopsy room. And yet we are somehow supposed to believe that Humes, Boswell, and Fink didn't know about that wound?
Sir, this is an area that I've covered a whole lot in my personal research. It starts, according to Paul Peters, and this is a piece of sealed testimony that Ben Bradley Jr. buried at the Kennedy Library. Paul Peters said that the telephone calls from Bethesda began immediately, and that is a quote, that's his words, immediately after the president's body left Dallas. Immediately. The Air Force One audio tapes show attempts to reach, and there's all kinds of discussion about Bethesda on the radio, Military District of Washington, that they already know. By the time the plane takes off, they already know. I mean, and then you've got Ebersol, Stringer, help me think of the others.
Levy, Custer, Jenkins.
No.
People who referred to the calls.
Who referred to telephone calls before or during the autopsy. Gerald Custer.
If I may just try. My best recollection, having not gone over everything, is in speaking to Dr. Humes and in reviewing all the records of the autopsy. When Dr. Humes did that autopsy, he did not know that there was a bullet wound in the neck.
Oh,
Do you think he could have lied? Do you think he could have lied about that?
Let me finish. As many of you will recall, when they turned the body over and they found a bullet wound in the back. And they couldn't understand where that bullet went. Remember, somebody stuck a finger in and pulled it out, so the bullet must have turned around and come out? Remember that? I'm not making this up. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. The reason he did that is because they couldn't understand what happened to the bullet in the back, because they didn't realize that the bullet in the neck was an exit wound. And whether everybody else in that autopsy room knew about it or not, it was Dr. Humes who was doing the autopsy. Dr. Fink was up there, but he didn't contribute to the autopsy at all. He was just observing, and Fink thought that if he did anything wrong, this is what Humes said, is if I did anything wrong, then Fink would have said something. Since he didn't say anything, I thought I was doing the right job. It wasn't until 24 or 36 hours later that Humes spoke with Perry on the telephone and found out that there was a bullet wound in the neck, and that's how he reconstructed the trajectory going from the back to the neck, and that's after which and that's why he got the measurements wrong, because then he made up some of the he approximated the measurements, and then he burnt his own papers, the own papers he had destroyed. But it was my impression then and is now, whatever telephone calls were made, that Humes, the nature and the way he did the autopsy, and his description of how he then changed the measurements a day or two later after speaking to Perry, that he didn't know that there was an exit wound in the front of the neck, and it's not so marked. It's not so marked on the diagram. When he draws the autopsy diagram, it just points to a tracheostomy in the front of the neck. There's no indication that there's a bullet hole in that area of tracheostomy. So that's my best interpretation of the findings.
Yeah. There is the other thing. The other thing is that Robert Livingston, who previously on the faculty of 5 different medical schools in the United States, and the founder of the neuroscience department at UC San Diego, who was then the scientific director of the National Institute of Neurological Disease and Blindness, called Humes, spoke to him on the phone on the day of the assassination, and discussed the nature of the throat wound with him. He has testified to that under oath in the Crenshaw lawsuit. And I think it's just improbable that Berkeley, who was the president's physician, who knew about all the wounds and the tracheotomy and everything like that, would not have communicated that to Humes. My own personal opinion is that Humes has lied about his ignorance of that, which has exculpated him, well, at least exonerated him from not having done the dissection he should have done to trace the track.
HSCA agency file number 002071, page 2, Boswell to, I'm sorry, Andy. I'm sorry, Andy Purdy. I was able to see the perimeter of the bullet wound within the incision of the tracheotomy.
This is Boswell describing his ability to make out the wound.
But he's describing it sometime later. I'm talking about the autopsy report and the way it proceeded. And one of the things that was of concern to us when we discussed the autopsy itself is if, in fact, Humes knew that the bullet in the back had exited through a hole in the neck, that there was a hole in the neck, he might not have done an autopsy. The reason they did the autopsy was to try to figure out what happened to the bullet that they couldn't find on X-ray, and because they didn't have an exit wound for the bullet in the back.
Well, I mean,
I'm confused on this. I'm well aware of what you and Kathy have been saying, and I got to tell you, I'm betwixt and between. Let me ask you guys something. Isn't there a quote attributed to Pierre Fink, who says, and I knew Pierre, I could close my eyes and saying with his pursed lips and his sweat, saying there is no exit wound for this hole? Didn't Pierre Fink say that?
He's referring.
So how do you?
That's on the back. That's the back wound. They're probably the back wound.
Yeah.
First of all, you have to understand.
That's what I'm talking about.
You have to understand, Michael. You're wrong about the question of they're doing the autopsy. They were looking for bullet evidence, but they didn't even know about the back wound theoretically until the latter stages of the autopsy, according to their own notes.
No. That's not quite right. What happened is Fink found it. Fink did not arrive until 8:30. He was called.
Fink didn't do anything in that autopsy.
Fink found Fink did find. He came at 8:30 after being called at 8. After being called before any incisions were made, they proceeded into the autopsy. They removed the brain, the heart, and the lungs. And at 8:30, Fink arrived, and this was the stage of the autopsy. He stopped everything at that point. This is according to his own notes. This is the Blumberg Memoranda, February of 1965. He stopped everything. It was at that point that he ordered additional X-rays, and then according to agents Siebert and O'Neill, he turned the body over, and Siebert pointed the wound to the back out to him.
I just don't want silence to mean that I agree with you. That isn't at all what I recall. And you may be right, but that's not my opinion.
Listen, obviously, a number of people on this panel don't think being polite and being courteous and waiting your turn is appropriate. I've indicated I would like to respond to a couple of these points, and I guess I better do the same thing that they're doing. Now, when you look at the photograph that Dr. Aguilar showed of McClellan showing a wound back here, and you looked at the drawing of Paul O'Connor showing a gaping wound back here, think back to this morning's session where they showed the autopsy photograph of the back of the head. And your speaker at that point said there was a large hole of exit. A large piece of bone was blown out, presumably leaving the scalp intact. Now, I asked Mike Bodden about that, and maybe he wants to comment about whether that's possible. Apparently, they were saying that higher wound that Mike says was a wound of entrance was actually a wound of exit. Of course, Dr. Humes said that under what the panel said was a higher wound was no defect. Not only was there not an entrance hole, there was no large gaping hole in the skull. So are we going to believe Humes?
You're misrepresenting his testimony.
Are we going to... I wrote the quote down. He said under the higher wound there was no defect bullet wound. I just wrote it down from your presentation.
Well, you have volume 7. Well, I'll read it to you. Go ahead.
The issue has been raised by Dr. Aguilar about whether the autopsy doctors are lying about the nature of the wounds and about seeing whether the photographs and X-rays accurately portrayed them. I would submit to you that if the wound was as McClellan and O'Connor are quoted here as saying, that there was a giant hole in the back of the head here, then all three autopsy doctors, regardless of how much or how little they did, are lying when they looked at that photograph of the back of the head, and there was that debate about whether the cowlick was entry or whether the loathing was entry. And I think we should put aside the question of, well, there might be mistakes. You know, under at least Dr. Aguilar's theory, either let's say they're lying or let's get on to some other issue.
Mr. Purdy, we had a question from the audience. Were the Dallas doctors, when you took testimony from them, were they shown these autopsy photos?
We showed them the eye-to-doc sketches of the autopsy photographs, which are essentially like traces, almost exact.
I'm not sure they're exact traces, but in other words, they were not shown the photographs.
That's correct.
All right. One of the implications you're making is that because they didn't dispute the photographs, that they're shown and presented as authentic photographs, that they basically are endorsing their authenticity. One of the things that they already did, and we know they did that, They signed a document saying that they know the photographic inventory is complete when they then gave testimony that it was incomplete. So we've known them, we already know that they've been duplicitous about this. We know that they have personally said, and they told you personally, Stringer said the photographic inventory was incomplete when I first examined it.
Gary, that's a whole different magnitude than their essential big picture conclusions. They said that there were 2 shots from the rear that struck the president.
The big picture
That's what they say. That's what all 3 of them say. And if you're saying there was a giant hole in the skull that blew out from a shot from the front, then they're lying.
The big picture
With respect to the question of they were shot from behind, is it reasonable to start an autopsy report dated November 24th, which says after he passed the building which had a man in the window with a gun, shots rang out, and we conclude that he was shot from behind?
Of course it's not reasonable, but you're dodging the essential question about whether they're lying, about whether there was a shot from the front.
All right, but if an autopsy report starts off with the essential conclusion that there's the assassin and there's the gun, what else could they conclude? What else could they conclude?
They were told. They were
and
told.
3 years later, if they're shown photographs, they're in a Hobson's choice.
Okay,
I lied back then. I want to come clean right now. Can I keep my license?
You said that there are 2 exit holes in the skull. This morning's speaker said there are 2 exit holes in the skull, 1 a shot from the front, 1 a shot from the back. The autopsy doctors say there was no such exit hole, such extra
But we
exit
have forensic pathologists here who are really the best in the business, who are saying that the opinions of these men can't be trusted on matters of forensics, and now you're going to hold forth their forensic opinions and ask us to accept them.
You're the one that's hold forth their forensic opinions by saying we should believe them when they say the entrance wound is lower. And you've also said last year and this year that we don't have to conclude that they're lying. I submit for your position, we have to conclude they're lying.
I agree they're lying.
And we agree that...
Let me make that very clear. They're lying.
Unfortunately, we have to conclude. If you handed me photographic material for your questions, I will have it to give back. We have to move on to the next panel. Thank you again.
In the interest of time, we'll forego the introductions. I think I've spoken up here enough that you know that I'm Gary Aguilar. I'd like to start with the slide before my first slide. In fact, and I'll see if I can get these things to work. Let's focus that. My comments here today are meant in the spirit of good fellowship and in camaraderie here. I am going to be speaking on a panel with other physicians and with an attorney and, of course, with Kathy Cunningham on the medical evidence here. And I think that the medical evidence is something which is important and quite interesting to me. I do not assume as an operating principle myself that I'm dealing with people in bad faith. I assume, in fact, that I'm dealing with people in good faith. And yet, because Mr. Purdy did allude to some troubling things that I found in the evidence, I thought that I will expand upon that. And there are a couple of other matters which I thought bear directly on the question of conspiracy in his death and on the medical findings, which I think are interesting and relevant to me. We'll try going forward with that. And that, how does... All right. The comment that Kathy Cunningham made to was a letter written by Thomas Canning to Robert Blakey, and it basically forms my thesis here with respect to the work done by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in medical evidence in the medical area. And that is that I think that if I were to look at the work that they did, my guess would be that the work suffered by virtue of the fact that the work was sequestered and that there was not an integration of information, that there was isolation of various parts working on the medical evidence, and I hope and expect to be able to demonstrate that here today, not only with slides, but in the questioning that will come afterward. But I want to draw your attention to Thomas Canning's remark here. He said, I wish to convey, and this is a letter to Robert Blakey, who organized this, and who I think it is through his organization and through the way he organized the HSCA that these problems largely arose. I think that had Mr. Tannenbaum here continued to be involved and Blakey not had been involved, I think that things would have been rather different, and the findings perhaps would have been rather different. In any case, he wrote, I wish to convey my judgment of how the parts of the overall investigation which I could observe were conducted. The compartmentalization which you either fostered or permitted to develop in the technical investigations made it nearly impossible to do good work in reasonable time and reasonable cost. Mr. Tannenbaum, in a phone conversation, made very clear to me something which should have been obvious and is obvious when you mention it, and that is that in the doing of good murder investigation, as with any kind of medical investigation or scientific investigation, you want to integrate as much information as you can and spread it as widely as you can. The last thing you want to do is compartmentalize and isolate different people's working in different areas of the investigation. And it's no less true, as I said, in murder investigations as it is in science, but it appears that it's probably what happened here. And if one were to be blamed for that, it would be Robert Blakey for having organized the HSCA's medical investigation into more like a CIA operation. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing, and the left hand was specifically prevented from knowing what the right hand was doing. As he wrote here, he said, the most frustrating part for me was to get quantitative data and even consistent descriptions from the forensics pathologist. Well, this is very discouraging. Now, the area that we've touched on here is the area of the wounds, and the area that Mr. Purdy mentioned was the wound descriptions and some controversy pertaining to those. I'll give a little bit of background by mentioning that the HSCA faced a very difficult problem because the Parkland doctors were already on record in the Warren Commission and in other places, newspaper interviews and books and interviews by authors, as having said that there was a defect in the rear of the head. Ignoring what people like Robert Groden, David Lifton, Harrison Livingston said, going right to the literature of the subject, we have from the Warren Commission volumes, Ken Clark describing a large wound beginning in the right occiput, extending into the parietal region. The occiput is the back of the head. Ken Clark was a professor of neurosurgery. He pretty well ought to know where the occiput is. You have Robert McClellan saying the right posterior portion of the skull had been extremely blasted. Charles Carrico saying that the defect was in the posterior skull. Malcolm Perry, posterior cranium. Ronald Coy Jones, backside of the head. Paul Peters, occiput, in the right occipital parietal area. So this is the kind of problem they face because the photographs tend not to support that, as we'll see. The photographs tend to support an entry wound with totally intact scalp and skull rearward and a defect on the front of the skull, as Mr. Purdy has in fact demonstrated, and which I'll show you here in a moment. We also have evidence that that was garnered by someone who's here today, Tink Thompson, not showing his diagram here, but you will see this is taken from Tink Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas, and this was what Robert McClellan drew, indicating where he remembered the wound being. Paul Peters, who wrote a letter, wrote an X with an arrow saying, that's where I saw it too, in essence, and it comes from Groden Livingston's book, High Treason. Now, I then went back to the earliest statements made by the Parkland witnesses and organized them along where they said they saw the wounds, and here is the compilation that I have here. You'll notice here that Adolf Giesecke, or Giesecke as he pronounced it when I spoke to him on the phone, I have X's all the way across because his Warren Commission testimony said that it went from the back to the front on the left side. Well, he was right about right and left. He was wrong about right and left orientation, but he said it went from the back of the skull to the front of the skull, so I put all that down. Ken Salyer said somewhat the same thing. Now, I sat in a hotel room in San Francisco or in a hotel lobby with Ken Salyer side by side looking at the autopsy photographs, and he pointed to the autopsy photographs at the rear of the head and said, I'm sure they touched that up right there. There was a defect that went behind that ear, although it was on the side of the skull from behind the ear to in front of the ear. And the other person was William Midget, who described the skull defect from the temporal side back behind the ear as well. In any case, you'll see that everyone there described also a defect in the rear of the skull, and most of the people described it exclusively there, the vast majority of them. Now, this is the comment that was published as part of the HSCA's volumes, and it said, and Andy Purdy, is denying to me that he wrote it. I have no reason to insist that he did. I don't know who wrote it, but I think that there was clear sequestration here. The people who wrote this were not familiar with the evidence, and the medical evidence is complex evidence. I think it was inappropriate for Blakey to have chosen an attorney fresh out of law school with no real experience in medicine, with all due respect to Andy Blakey, who I think is a fine fellow, but no specific experience in this to interpret this kind of evidence. I mean, this is something that should require some expertise, and it wasn't done that. In any case, critics of the Warren Commission's medical evidence findings have found on the observations recorded by the Parkland Hospital doctors. They believe it's unlikely the trained medical personnel could be so consistently in error regarding the nature of the wound. And to dismiss this huge problem they had with the Parkland witnesses, they wrote, in disagreement with the observations of the Parkland doctors or the 26 people present at the autopsy. All of those interviewed attending the autopsy corroborated the general location of the wounds as depicted in the photographs. None had differing accounts. And Andy Purdy to Sylvia Chase on KRON TV demonstrated exactly where that wound was. That's Andy Purdy, and he's an amazing guy. I mean, he looks today no different than he does there. I mean, he does not age. But you can see, there's Andy Purdy indicating on the photographs, which we'll be seeing in a minute, where he was, where the wound was. And this is what he is saying at this point in the Sylvia Chase interview. The wound was basically in this kind of an area, which is above the forehead, and that's where it was. Now, he was going on pretty good experimental evidence in saying that. You can see this is a diagram taken from Latimer's work. Now, I have problems with Latimer's work for the reason that I have spoken to other people who've done research in this area, and one thing that needs to be commented upon about Latimer's work is that he shot skulls from behind, trying to replicate the situation of the shooting, and he reported that every skull he shot came backward toward the rifle. Now, apparently, Alvarez did the study. Not every melon went backward toward the rifle. Some did, some didn't. Doug DeSalles did the study and did quite an extensive study, and most did not go back toward the rifle. And in fact, I would be willing to bet, I always make these bets and no one ever takes me up on them, I'll bet $10,000 that you can't recreate 10 shootings using Mannlicher Carcano shells on skulls where they all come back to the shooter. I'll just bet you can't do it. And when somebody tells me that you got 10 out of 10 in a study that has as many variables as shooting skulls in the manner in which they were supposed to have done it, I think that they're fudging their results. I mean, I see that sort of stuff when I was a TA in college. In any case, that's the reason I'm not very mistrustful. But you can see that the defect is where it quotes where it's supposed to be. It's up here in front of the skull, more or less, you know, near in the front of the skull. The problem that we face here is that you go back to the autopsy report, and the original autopsy report says there's a large irregular defect on the scalp and skull of the right involving chiefly the parietal bone, but extending somewhat into the temporal and occipital regions. Now, if you were to take one area, I've cut out this little oval here. If you were to make one defect in the skull that basically this 13 centimeter defect, because they indicate it's 13 centimeters, and it had to be largely parietal, but extending somewhat into the occipital and temporal regions. Am I inaccurate in thinking that it would be like that? I mean, is that what the autopsy report is saying? I mean, it seems that those are the words that I'm familiar with as a physician that they're saying. In any case, that's a problem. Okay, so at least the autopsy pathologists are not corroborating Andy Purdy's placement here in Nora Latimer's work about the defect being in the rear of the skull, if that's where you shoot him. But then you have something, and I would like to indicate my thanks to Stuart Galliner for this lovely image. And here they indicate that the in-shoot was here in the Warren Commission, Commission Exhibit 388. And as we saw earlier today, they labeled a skull, and all of them labeled the entry point in this region right here. Here's the external occipital protuberance with that little dot on it right there, and over to the right, and perhaps just below is one of the dots, another one is there, and a third one is there. Here's where the HSCA determined the entrance wound was. Now, you know, we're talking about 3 professor pathologists. These guys taught residents. It's amazing. I mean, you'd have failed a first-year resident for making a mistake like that on a location of a back wound. And these kinds of dimensions are significant in a skull. I mean, if you had a skull, which, gosh, I just happen to have. What a coincidence. You can see where I put these dots. I put the dots there. Now, you're talking about, you know, about the real wound being up here, but you got 3 dumb docs that, gosh, they made a mistake and put it down at the bottom of the skull. Now, that's a big mistake to make. It's in a different bone. It's really in a different part of the skull. I have just a lot of difficulties understanding that they would have made such a mistake. The only document we have that traces right back to the night of the autopsy is the autopsy face sheet prepared by Boswell, which I depict here. This is the whole face sheet minus a little fragment of bone on the bottom, and this is a blow-up of this portion right here. The reason I bring this out is to point out one very important factor here, which was also relevant in HSCA testimony, volume 7, page 246 to 261. And that is that he has 17 and the word missing in here, and indicates 17 missing. Well, he was asked about that for the HSCA. He said, oh, well, when I examined the body, there was a defect 17 centimeters long from fore to aft. And at the bottom, he has these little fragments here, and that's a 3, that's a 6, that I think is a 4, okay? 3, 6, and 4. That'll be relevant in a moment when I show you this. Did I? Somebody want to advance that? This one does not seem to be quite as... Right there. Now, let's assume that on the night of the autopsy, Dr. Boswell knew how to use a centimeter ruler. I mean, I think that's a pretty safe assumption, okay? What I thought is, 17 centimeters is a very large defect in the skull. Now, it says 13 centimeters in the autopsy report. I'm going to get back to that in a minute, but 17 centimeters is what he wrote when he actually had the body in his hands and was making the measurement on the defect. Let's assume that the defect came out all the way in the front of the skull. Let's say that the defect was all the way at the front of the head, 4 centimeters above the supraorbital ridge, right there. That's as far forward as it went. Well, I put a ruler on this skull, and I have the ruler here, actually a different one, but it still measures the same, 17 centimeters. You measure back from the most anterior place the defect could have been, otherwise you'd have seen it blowing out of his forehead. And we're talking about right at the hairline here. You measure back 17 centimeters, and you're spot on the external occipital protuberance. If you measure 6 centimeters below the external occipital protuberance, you're at the lowest point of the skull, the foramen magnum. Now, I don't know whether he meant 6 centimeters was, above the foramen magnum, but by that, if in fact he was, he certainly biangulated that location of the wound to the external occipital protuberance, and 17 centimeters gets its spot right on the money. If, by contrast, you take your centimeter ruler, put it at the high location, and measure forward, 17 centimeters is out here in midair. So I'm willing to admit that this is a puzzle. I don't have a good answer for this. Here we have the diagram, and here we have, this was prepared for the Warren Commission on the left. Now, in his HSCA testimony, Boswell said something that was very important that I called him and asked him about, and in those days he was speaking to me. I asked him, I said, on the face sheet you prepared, there was a 17 centimeter defect, and as he had testified for the HSCA, I said, was that defect meant to represent the size of the wound before placing the fragment of bone that arrived late into the autopsy into the occipital wound, and the 13 centimeters meant to reflect the size of the wound after the fragment was in place? He said, right. Was there one large defect in the head from fore to aft, or were there two? Just one defect. This is Boswell. This is a tape recording. Anyone who wants a copy of the tape recording, I'd be happy to give it to Dr. Wecht or whoever would like to have it, even Mr. Purdy. Then I asked him again. I said, does the Rydberg diagram 388 show the bone fragment back in place in the rear of the skull? Yeah, the wound of entrance was at the base of that defect, and the shelving was on the inner surface of the bone, and it was half on the intact portion of the skull and half on the fragment that we received from Dallas. So he's saying that that diagram there isn't the way the skull really looked when they saw the body. The skull really looked like that, or some variation of that. I just took Stuart Gallinar's image and colored it in to show a much larger defect than that. So the diagram showed the bone back in place. Boswell said, yep. He said, yep, it did. Now, that seems like a pretty crazy idea, but we have one other thing. That's Paul O'Connor prepared a diagram of what the skull looked like that he saw on the night of the autopsy, and lo and behold, there it is, a diagram that's not too terribly different than what Boswell is describing for us, without that last little bit of fragment back in the back of the skull around the entrance wound. This is from Robert Grodin's book in a reconstruction. This is something that he discussed with Robert McClelland, an image very similar to this, showing where he saw the defect in the rear of the skull. This is all very puzzling. Now, you then are faced, unfortunately, with the autopsy photograph, which shows the back of the scalp and skull completely intact. And then the interesting thing to me is reading something that was only relatively recently released by Pierre Fink. And he said, it is my professional opinion to determine the anatomic location of wounds, the viewing of the physical evidence itself, the injuries seen on the dead body of President Kennedy was a better source than illustrations of the evidence. Drawings, X-ray films, and photographs are subject to distortion. I'm going to go on about the question of distortion in a minute. It's freezing up there again on the left. You want to try to advance that left slide? I keep pushing the same button. Yeah, maybe the battery's low or something. So here we have Andy Purdy pointing out the defect here on where the defect was. Ronald Jones puts his hand in the same place. But Ronald Jones, in the same Caroline interview, is saying, certainly I can tell you the wound is not here. That's what he was saying. In that very, I've got the tape here. Anybody wants to see it, they're welcome to look at it. Now, Jones was not somebody who changed his mind like the people who the American Medical Association trotted out, who all of a sudden had a different view 30 years after the case than they had when they testified at the Warren Commission. You know, that was very embarrassing to me as a physician to see these guys, deny what they previously said under oath. But Park, in interviews with 3 different times, he basically said, if you brought him in here today, I'd still say he was shot from the front based on what I saw. And this is Jones to David Lifton, Jones to Brad Parker on 2 different occasions. And I think the most important thing is that he says in the first one, I didn't think that there was any wound, I didn't appreciate any wound anyway in the right temporal area, the right side of the upper part of the head, you know, over the, or in front of the ears, say, or anything like that. He didn't appreciate anything there. Jenkins, who's one of these guys who was trotted out by the American Medical Association to knock Crenshaw down, said in his Warren Commission testimony that you couldn't see the defect. He was an anesthesiologist who huddled right around the head. He said you couldn't see the defect in the head from standing along the side. That's what he said then when he was under oath and, of course, close to the events. So we have all these witnesses. You have Charles Crenshaw down here in the bottom. You have Ron Jones, who is showing you where he's the one who's showing that it was not up here. This is where he's saying it really was, okay? Beverly Oliver said this, Phil Willis said that, Marilyn Williams, Ed Hoffman, Robert McClellan, Paul Peters, Ken Salyer, Charles Carrico, on and on and on, all saw defect in the rear of the head. Same ones that we showed on slide right before here on slide left, but whoa, what do we have here? Now we have the Bethesda witnesses, Paul O'Connor, Chester O'Connor, Aubrey Reich, Theron Ward, Floyd Reedy, Frank O'Neill. They're all saying the same thing. Amazing. Now, we have to understand something, and this is what I find absolutely fascinating. Everybody's wrong. Right? Apparently. Clint Hill, Warren Commission testimony. This is something that wasn't mentioned by the HSCA. Right rear portion of the skull was missing. Roy Kellerman saying that to the left of the right ear, sir, and a little high. Yes, that portion of the skull was missing when I saw him. Will Greer, toward the rear. And what was the condition of the skull at that point, Mr. Greer? The skull was completely gone toward the rear. Phil Wheel. These are new releases. These are old stuff, the Warren Commission volumes. This is new stuff that was just recently released. A slight bruise of the right temple, but I did not see any significant damage to any other part of the head. The wound was in the back of the head, so you would not see it because the president was lying face up. So now you've got Ronald Jones, you've got the anesthesiologist, and you got somebody at Bethesda saying when the president's lying down face up, you can't see the wound, and yet it's up here. I'm baffled by this. Chester Boyers, one person who said, he said the entrance wound is in the rear to the right of the external occipital protuberance, and it exited along the top right side of the skull toward the rear and just above the right eyebrow. Well, I don't know what he means by that. It exited up here and back here. I mean, he was one of these people who basically said it exited from all sides of the head, front to rear. I don't know. Tom Robinson, where was this wound? Robinson, now he's the guy that prepared the body for funeral. He was the mortician. Robinson, directly behind the back of his head, approximately between the ears or higher up. No, I would say pretty much between them. Now, is this the same as this? I mean, one has to wonder. John Ebersol, very important witness, I think, when he said originally to Art Smith, who's here today, in fact, I think Art Smith had to go home, but he has a copy of a tape recording that he made with him. He asked him, before he went to speak to the HSCA, and this is in David Lifton's book, I thought Art Smith was somebody I had never run into, but he was here last night and told me he's going to send me a copy of the tape. He interviewed Ebersol. He asked him, where was the defect in the head? He said, the back of the head was missing. The back of the head was missing. So then he was showing the photographs to the HSCA, and he said, gosh, you know, my recollection was more of an occipital wound than this, but had you asked me this without seeing these pictures, you'd know I would have put the wound here rather than more forward. And he also said, of course, he was positioning the head to take the x-rays. He certainly wouldn't have been in a position to know where the wound was. David Lifton, Harrison Livingston, Robert Groden, and others interviewed Bethesda witnesses and all described a defect in the rear of the skull. Now, I want you to know that those last interview witnesses, all those interviews were suppressed for 50 years. And this is the thing that we've spoken about. John Newman has spoken about it, Dan Alcorn and others have, that generally when we have uncovered this stuff, the evidence has never been withheld for good national security reasons that we ever see. It's withheld apparently because it confounds the previous thesis of the investigating organizations, be it the Warren Commission or the HSCA. Here are diagrams that were also suppressed. Here's Tom Robinson, the mortician. Where's the defect? Back of the head. Here's Siebert, the FBI agent. Defect, back of the head. Here's O'Neill showing a defect, the back of the head, back of the head. Here is, does anybody remember? Oh, that's Jenkins, back of the head. Here is Kellerman. Kellerman couldn't tell right from left. The defect's on the left side. It should have been on the right. And the only person who drew a diagram that is perhaps compatible, if not completely compatible with the defect here, is this one by Lipsy. He made a lot of other statements, but you can see that even here the defect extends well behind the ear. So these are the diagrams that had to be suppressed for national security reasons by the organization that was going to settle the answer about the medical questions for us. So let's go back and look at the evidence according to the Parkland Hospital witnesses and compare it with what Bethesda witnesses said. And yep, most all the Parkland witnesses, as I said, showed it in the rear of the head. So do the Bethesda witnesses. So now we have a very important problem. And just as, to paraphrase the HSCA, most of the consultants, the HSCA, felt it was very improbable that such trained witnesses could be wrong about the location of the wound at Parkland. But so apparently were all the Bethesda witnesses. How could they also be wrong? Here's the defect in the back of the skull, and here's the skull photograph. Now, you've got Humes looking at this because the HSCA is telling him, no, Dr. Humes, the entrance wound was right here. It wasn't down here. Humes, while he is looking at this diagram, and Purdy may have been sitting there while this was happening, and I don't know whether Dr. Bodden was, but while he's sitting there looking at this diagram, Humes is saying, no, and that was a wound, the lower object he's referring to, and the wound on the skull precisely coincided with it. I can assure you that as we reflected the scalp to get this point here, there was no defect corresponding to this, the higher wound, in the skull at any point. I don't know what that is. It could be, to me, clotted blood. I just don't know what it is. It certainly was not any wound of entrance. The HSCA reported that Fink strongly believed, according to that slide I showed you earlier, that the observations of the autopsy pathologists were more valid than individuals who might subsequently examine photographs. Incidentally, the direct quote that I gave you earlier from Fink stating that clearly was also suppressed for 50 years. For no obvious reason other than the fact it tended to confound the medical conclusions that were being misrepresented by the HSCA. Now, the most important argument, I think, that the x-rays and photographs are complete and authentic is the statement that you'll find in post-mortem, and it is a statement signed by Humes, Boswell, Stringer, and Ebersol on 11/10/1966. And they write, the x-rays and photographs described and listed above include all the x-rays and photographs taken by us during the autopsy. We have no reason to believe that any other photographs and x-rays were made during the autopsy. Now, think about it a minute. You go on a vacation trip. It's like your honeymoon trip, okay? Real important to you. And you take, 60 pictures. You don't open it up for 3 years, and then you're given a raft of pictures, and you're saying, and you're asked, were these all the pictures you took? Is there anyone in this room who can honestly tell me, yes, these are absolutely all the pictures we took? No, you're not going to remember after 3 years whether that's a complete inventory of pictures. But the interesting thing is, did these guys write this? They didn't. The Justice Department wrote this thing and had them sign it. And in fact, they're on record as having said that the autopsy photographic record's incomplete. They're on a record all over the place, and I'll get to that. But you can see here, on the afternoon of November 10th, 1966, I took the original and 1 carbon of this document, Report on Inspection of Naval Medical Staff at the National Archives, and I took it to the Naval Medical Center, Bethesda, where it was read and signed by Humes, Boswell, Ebersol, and Stringer. Certain incorrections were made. They prepared this at Justice, said, okay, boys, sign this, and they're good patriots. They signed it. Stringer. He remembers taking at least 2 exposures to the body cavity. There's no exposure to the body cavity. Humes specifically recalled photographs were taken of the president's chest. Those don't exist. I've been to the National Archives and seen the originals myself. They're not there. Boswell thought they photographed the thoracic cavity and lung. Carni, he recalls them putting a probe and taking pictures. The body was laying on its side. Now, these are all doctors. I guess all doctors with faulty memories, except that they can remember 3 years ago that the photographs that they took is complete in photographs they haven't seen in 3 years. Floyd Reeve, I thought we took about 6 pictures. I think it was 3 film packs of internal portions of the body. Andy Purdy interviewed Stringer and said it was his recollection that all the photographs that he had taken were not present in 1966 when he saw the photographs. He noted that the receipt had some of the film holders had no film in one side of the cassettes. Now you got to understand, this guy's a professional photographer. If anybody's used a view camera, you know how film cassettes work. It's impossible to load in an empty film cassette and take photographs. And they're saying, oh yes, some of these came back empty with no film in them. Well, it's not something that can happen. Charles Petty and Fink had a long conversation. I'm not going to go into it in the interest of time here, but Fink was told, he's looking at the back of the photograph, he told them in a memo to Blumberg in 1966 that he had photographed the skull the internal external aspects of the skull wound to document it. And he's being shown this and asked, is that the one that you took? And they're showing him the back of the skull with the scalp intact. And he says, no, that's skull, that's scalp, not skull. You're showing me soft tissue, not the skull wound that I took. He specifically denied that the skull wounds were the ones that he took so that you could forensically prove the entrance, which would have been a very important thing to prove photographically anyhow. So I'm going to end where I started, and that is by saying, and I would like to ask Dr. Bodden, I showed some images here of diagrams that these people prepared. Did you ever see those before? Those diagrams prepared by the Bethesda witnesses showing defects in the rear of the skull and so on? Did you ever see those images?
We looked at all of the autopsy photos.
No, and I'm not talking about the ones that were prepared by the witnesses at Bethesda.
Well, no.
You never saw those. Now, this is the kind of sequestration and, the kind of compartmentalization we're talking about. Those are important forensic pieces of evidence. The Bethesda witnesses are describing what they saw. Who should have seen them? Weck never saw them. He told me that last night. Bodden's sitting here today. He's telling you he never saw them. Why not? In any case, the final conclusion is one that Canning also came up with. I did not anticipate that the study of the photographic record itself would reveal the major discrepancies in the Warren Commission findings, but such has turned out to be the case. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have an oxygen tank for Gary? Wow, I have to tell you, I've been to a lot of these conferences, and I don't think I've ever seen anybody say as much substantive discussion in as little time and keep to it and go right on. So, Gary, thank you again. That was outstanding. Proving why he didn't need an introduction. I was going to read the thing from the blurb and saying, besides that, he's a nice guy, and I love his car because I got to talk to it a lot this summer.
Particularly knowledgeable about medical aspects of this case, but is also very well informed on virtually anything. He has been my consultant repeatedly and has clarified my thinking on numerous occasions and on numerous issues. It is with great pleasure, and it is my personal privilege to introduce him to you today. And I certainly encourage anyone who needs to get out for a break for a second to come right back in, because he's very worth listening to.
Bob, I think there's one tray of, okay. I think there's one tray of slides on the gray tray. Unlike the other members of this panel, my relationship with Andy Purdy goes back to HSCA days. Robert Groden and I spent the night with Andy Purdy's home when we came to appear before the House Assassinations Committee back in 1977. And there were a number of memos and phone calls which I had with Andy Purdy at that time. At that time, Mr. Purdy said that, rightly so, that I can't talk with you about that. It's the committee's business, and the committee has an investigation ongoing, and rightly he said he couldn't talk about certain things that I was curious about. And Mr. Purdy, of course, at the time he did his work for this committee, at the time he was telling me this, did not know if or when the HSCA documents would be released. They have almost entirely been released, and I'm glad that he can come here. I'm glad that he can come and talk to us now that the investigation is over. I'm happy that he has a chance to clarify and answer some questions. Mr. Purdy, I know from the days he was with Mark Lane's group and at the University of Virginia and thereafter that he is a very bright person, he's a very articulate person, and very happy that he has a chance to come here and to answer some questions. It would seem to me to be the right thing to do in my case, since we have a person here who actually worked with the House Assassinations Committee in the medical evidence, that we have a person here that, and so I framed my presentation basically in a series of questions from Mr. Purdy, and questions which I'm sure he will note and perhaps can give us some answers to. And the first one has to do with the document here, which is on the screen at the time. This is document 6165. It is a 6-page letter from Pierre Fink to Andy Purdy, dated February 26, 1978. This letter has been referred, that is to say these 6 pages have been withheld at the archives and have not been released with the rest of Fink's material. It's interesting, this material comes from CIA, which immediately raises, I think, some questions. Fink, a pathologist, CIA withholds the document. The document contains references to anti-Castro Cubans, William Harvey, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, etc., etc. Not exactly a medical type of subject, and CIA asked that it be withheld. And if one takes an index of the things that Fink said that he provided to the committee, the only thing which he provided to the House Assassinations Committee, which was generated in 1978, was this 6-page letter to Andy Purdy. And so Mr. Purdy is here today, and it would be nice if, when we give him an opportunity, he would explain to us what was in that 6-page letter and why the CIA would withhold a document generated by a medical person in this case. Equally intriguing to me is Mr. Purdy's questioning of Thomas Robinson. Mr. Robinson was a cosmetician for Gawler's funeral home, which handled the embalming of President Kennedy. Mr. Purdy took this recorded deposition of Mr. Robinson early on in the investigation. And in this, as you can see from the slide, he gave Mr. Robinson a chance to quote, you had heard some things which were not correct about the autopsy, and what would those things be? I was terribly interested in Mr. Robinson's answer, which was, the time the people started, and in parentheses, autopsy, the body was taken, and the body never came, and things like that. I found that very interesting. Mr. Purdy apparently didn't find that very interesting, because the next question is, can I ask you about the wounds? Those of us who have been around this a long time remember Wesley Liebler. Mr. Zapruder, your film has been very helpful to the commission way back in 1964. So he will probably clarify this for us also. And I also asked him, since this was tape recorded, we could probably get the release of the tape. I understand the tapes of outside contact reports and so forth are also to be made available. Dr. Perry was questioned. There's been a great deal of controversy about this throat wound, as whether the throat wound as seen in the autopsy photographs is the same as Dr. Perry left it. When I read Mr. Purdy's interview with Dr. Perry, I discovered that they didn't show Perry a photograph of the throat wound. They showed him a tracing. And of course we will ask Mr. Purdy to explain why we didn't show him the photograph and say, is this the way you left the throat wound? Because I've interviewed Mr. Perry since that time, and he will not say, he will not take a definite stand on it. And what was on the tracing, and is the tracing a part of the record, and will it be released too? Paul O'Connor, controversial in this. Andy Purdy interviewed Paul O'Connor, and Paul O'Connor told him that the body arrived in a body bag. This interview took place, as you can see, in 1977. Subsequent to that time, Mr. Purdy interviewed 10 people who were in the morgue, many of whom were present when the body arrived. There is no record that Mr. Purdy asked any of these 10 if they saw a body bag, was the body in a body bag, or how the body was wrapped. It may have been done. It did not find its way into the outside contact reports, if it did. Now, in that regard, I assume that a timetable was constructed and that the House Assassinations Committee's medical panel attempted to create a construct which dealt with when the body arrived, where it went, who handled it, when the autopsy began, and this sort of thing. If indeed the House Assassinations Committee did create such a timetable, I would like for Mr. Purdy and anyone else who can speak for the panel to explain how they justified and clarified and reconciled certain things. And this is based on government documents. This is not based upon the findings of any researcher. The Secret Service says that the body arrived at 6:55. The Washington Post article I reported who was present clarifies that. 7:17, the body was carried into the morgue. Siebert and O'Neill's report, they say they carried it in. They entered the exact time at 7:17. Dr. Hill's statement is that the pre-autopsy inspection began at 7:35. Samuel Byrd and the Military District of Washington casket team and others entered into the official record that they carried the casket in at 8 o'clock. Now, I'm not here to advocate or debunk body alteration. My question would really be, was there any effort made to reconcile the fact that Humes began the examination of the body before the body came in the morgue? Or is there any way to explain how the FBI brought the body in at 7:17 and somebody else brought it in at 8, according to their own records? And O'Connor's record is so specific that it contains entries like 7:56, etc., to the minute. 7:17 is pretty precise. There is terribly persuasive evidence that the examination of the body had to have begun by 7:35. Some of that persuasive evidence, circumstantial evidence, would be that Hume says the first incision was made at 8:15. There would have been no way that the body could have been brought in at 8. Photographs and x-rays taken and an incision done at 8:15. But we could probably get some clarification for this in a moment. I'm sure that the House Assassinations Committee bumped up against this problem when it investigated the assassination and the timetable, and that Mr. Purdy will explain what the truth is here and where it lies. Now, I want to talk a moment. I don't expect you to read this. These are a couple of documents which relate to the snow, what I call the snow reconstruction. There was to be a snow job done on the president's head. A noted forensic anthropologist was to make a three-dimensional model of the head. It was to be an elaborate thing with lift-off and portions that could be taken apart to demonstrate the trajectory of the bullet through the president's head. A number of documents were generated back and forth with Miss Downey of the HSCA staff, Mr. Snow, and others in the preparation of this document. And it was never made. And maybe while he's here, Mr. Purdy can tell us why the committee decided never to go forward or not to go forward with the three-dimensional model depicting the wounds of the head in such a manner that they could be three-dimensionalized. There is a basic contradiction here, and many of you are aware of it. And that contradiction is between what human eyes saw and what the autopsy x-rays and photographs depict. I believe they're irreconcilable. The House Assassinations Committee made a choice. They went with the photographs and x-rays and apparently decided that every eye which saw the president's wounds saw them incorrectly. There's one other thing that I would like to ask Mr. Purdy about, and it's perfect time. In Michael Beschloss's book, The Crisis Years, he has written that Lyndon Johnson was very dissatisfied with the findings of the Warren Report, and that he asked CIA, called in Richard Helms, and he asked Helms to conduct an investigation by the CIA. Helms said that the CIA obtained the Zapruder film and also the autopsy materials in 1964. Mr. Purdy will tell us in a moment, I hope he will, whether or not the House Assassinations Committee was aware, if this is true or not, first of all, whether the House Assassinations Committee was aware of this or not, because if this is true, it would mean that the CIA had the autopsy photographs and x-rays 2 years before any other government agency ever had them, which could be very relevant. The facts are that the x-rays and photographs depict what no human eyes ever saw, either in Dallas or Bethesda. This is the fundamental contradiction as I see it. We know where the House Assassinations Committee came down, and Mr. Purdy will hopefully explain the rationalization that ever so many groups of human eyes were failed in their observations that particular weekend. I believe that Mr. Purdy was working toward a preconceived opinion. Pierre Fink was rather difficult for the committee. Fink appeared on March 21st, and he testified. There was quite a clash about the location of the entrance wound in the head. Fink insisting that it was low at the external occipital protuberance. I believe that Mr. Purdy's questioning in this shows that he was trying very much to get him to move that wound up. In this particular slide, I think you can see that he asked him, well, you can see what the question is. You're probably from your end better than I can from this angle. What inference would you reach from this if there was a wound in the cowlick area? Fink would refuse to answer and would not take a definite stand. And so then, I believe Mr. Purdy asked him a question which assumes facts which are not in evidence. He says, suppose you saw this picture and the people who performed the autopsy also told you that this was a wound. The problem with that is, of course, the people who performed the autopsy never did say that there was a wound in the cowlick area. And then, a kind of a last straw, Fink still wouldn't answer. Then he said, is there any way you'd be in a position to say that it wasn't a wound of entrance? Which reminded me a little bit of a very, very long question framed a long time, what may be the world's longest hypothetical, formed by Mr. Spector, who's Mr. Purdy, by the time he missed, when he went to work for the committee, had a rather low opinion of. Now, that second interview with Fink asked to appear the next day. I assume he did. Mr. Purdy will tell us. He testified on Saturday. On Sunday, there appeared another session with Pierre Fink. I thought that very unusual. He appeared before the committee again, and in that interview, which is 15 pages, that second interview with Pierre Fink ends abruptly, in the middle of a page. And it is noted on the outside that the interview ends abruptly. And it was taped, and I'm wondering, and we'll probably get it clarified here in a moment, if the tape ends abruptly, if the tape can be found, and just what is in the tape. Mr. Purdy has come here to say that there may be a conspiracy, but not in the medical evidence. And I'm suspicious. Look, maybe he wants us to help us look at the assassination again, but not in the medical area. Don't throw me in the bribe patch. It perhaps reminds me of a little girl who says, "Daddy, I've hidden my doll. Go look for it. Look anywhere, but don't look behind the closet. Don't look in the closet." Not all conspiracies are equal, and the medical evidence is crucial. If Kennedy was shot from the front, I think the medical evidence had to have been manipulated in order to cover that. Mr. Purdy is here to offer us again what I call Blakey's benign conspiracy. Mr. Purdy offers us Oswald and perhaps some discontented fair play for Cuba Committee members shooting and missing from the grassy knoll. Mr. Purdy says trust the medical evidence, because Mr. Purdy knows the Fair Play for Cuba Committee couldn't get autopsy findings changed. Castro couldn't get autopsy findings changed. Even the Mafia couldn't get autopsy findings changed. Mr. Purdy knows that if the medical evidence was manipulated, elements of the United States government had to have been involved. And that, in my opinion, is why Mr. Purdy is here. And Mr. Purdy is a lawyer, and a very good one, I hear. And I want to call your attention finally to what he said in his opening. And I think I got this right. You will never be able to convince the established media that the medical evidence isn't valid. He did not say he believed it was.